Once upon a time, in a small town, there was a young woman named Emily who decided to give online dating a try. She downloaded the popular dating app Tinder and started swiping through profiles, hoping to find her perfect match. One evening, as she scrolled through the app, she came across a profile that caught her attention. The profile picture showed a handsome man with piercing blue eyes and a charming smile. Tinder profile, his name was James, and his bio read, "Looking for an adventure? Swipe right." Intrigued by his mysterious aura, Emily swiped right, and to her surprise, they instantly matched. James wasted no time and sent her a message. "Hey, Emily. Fancy a late-night walk in the nearby woods? It's said to be haunted. Are you brave enough?" Emily's heart raced at the thought of a thrilling adventure, and without hesitation, she replied, "Sounds exciting. Let's meet there in an hour." As the clock struck midnight, Emily arrived at the entrance of the dark and eerie woods. James was already waiting for her, leaning against a weathered tree. "Emily. You made it," James said, his voice filled with anticipation. "Are you ready to experience true fear?" Emily nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. They ventured into the woods, their footsteps echoing through the silence. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy of trees, casting long, ominous shadows. As they walked deeper into the forest, Emily started hearing faint whispers and rustling leaves. She turned to James. "Did you hear that?" James grinned and replied, "The spirits of this place have awakened. They're watching us." Suddenly, a chilling breeze blew through the trees, extinguishing their flashlights. Panic gripped Emily as darkness enveloped them. She reached out, desperately searching for James, but he had vanished into thin air. "James, where are you?" Emily called out, her voice trembling with fear. But there was no response, only the haunting silence that surrounded her. Terrified, Emily stumbled through the woods. Her heart pounding in her chest, strange sounds echoed around her, as if unseen entities were whispering maliciously in her ears. Out of nowhere, a voice whispered, "Emily, I've been waiting for you." Emily froze, her eyes darting in every direction. Then, she saw a pair of glowing red eyes peering at her from the darkness. She tried to run, but invisible hands grabbed her, holding her in place. The voice grew louder, filling the air with a bone-chilling laugh. "You shouldn't have come here, Emily. Now you'll never leave." Emily screamed, her pleas echoing through the night, but no one came to her rescue. The spirits of the haunted woods had claimed another victim, their laughter mingling with Emily's cries of terror. Time seemed to stand still as Emily's screams faded away, swallowed by the darkness of the cursed forest. The next morning, a hiker stumbled upon the entrance to the woods. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to explore. As he ventured deeper, he noticed a faint glimmer in the distance. Its Tinder app still open. The hiker shuddered, realizing the grim fate that had befallen the adventurous young woman. From that day on, locals warned of the cursed woods and the spirits that lurked within. The story of Emily's terrifying encounter spread far and wide, a chilling reminder of the dangers that await those who dare to seek excitement in the darkness of the unknown.
I'm going to tell you about my first boyfriend. He was my first kiss, and also my first abusive relationship. We started dating when I was a preteen. He was super attentive and protective of me from the very beginning. It wasn't until the 5th month when I started noticing the alarms going off in my head. He had taken me on a cute roller skating date, and we had sat down for a bit to take a break when 2 of his friends showed up. At this point, the vibe from him was no longer safe. The smile he had 5 minutes beforehand was replaced with a look of pure hatred. He switched into this odd predator mode and told me to kiss him with tongue in front of his friends. I told him that I was just not ready to do something like that, and especially not in front of other people. He didn't like that answer and pulled my face to his and started forcing his tongue in my mouth. I was a pretty small girl, but luckily, I was able to push him away long enough to start running towards a more populated part of the skate rink. I told him to stay away from me while I waited for my mum to pick me up. I didn't tell my mum what happened because I was in shock and confused. I was young and didn't want to get into trouble for kissing a boy, so I decided to just ignore him until I was able to process everything. A week of successfully avoiding him at school passes, when he worked up the nerve to try something again. He found me surrounded by a group of friends and decided to try his luck. I didn't even notice he was there until we were practically bumping elbows. Being that close to him definitely put me on edge, and I nearly defecate myself when he started to speak to me. It was all pointless small talk, until he realized I wasn't in the forgiving mood when his mood shifted like before, and he was just staring at me like I was the most disgusting human on the planet. I was holding one of those old portable CD players when he yanked it out my hand and started trying to shove it in his bag in an attempt to steal it. I yelled at him to give it back and tried prying it from him, which apparently took offense to him because he punched me in the face with enough force to drop me to the ground. I obviously started crying, and we were both sent to the principal's office. His dad was the football coach in that Midwestern community, so he was able to talk the principal into only requiring his son to attend detention once for punishment. We didn't see each other too much after that, and thankfully ended up going to different high schools. Then I run into him at Taco Bell Drive-thru my sophomore year. I didn't realize he was the cashier until I was at the window about to pay when we made awkward eye contact. I pretended to not recognize him and hurried with the transaction until I was able to speed away. Unfortunately, he saw our chance meeting as a sign of fate and attempted to send the equivalent of "you up" to my Facebook profile. Unfortunately, I can never unsee his ultra cringy attempt at flirtation. "I think I saw you at Taco Bell today. I was the cashier. You're pretty cute, and I was wondering if you wanted to send some pics." My response was an immediate block, and I made sure to let my sister know about the incident because I just had to tell someone. If I had known then just how dangerous this teenage boy would become, I wouldn't have taken any of the incidents so lightly. But I'm not psychic, and after some awkward laughs, I moved on with my life and continued to date less rubbish people. Fast forward to today, when my sister sends me an article from her local news report featuring my dear first boyfriend's picture. Apparently, he decided to attack someone with a large weapon in the throat at a popular venue when they tried defending a woman he was physically attacking. We dated nearly 10 years ago, but I still can't shake the feeling that I definitely dodged a bullet. It's a strange feeling when you realize that dangerous people are weaving in and out of your life without you even knowing before it's too late sometimes. According to the comments in this article, he had a habit of assaulting the women in his life and had a history with obsessive stalking. I imagine justice will be served swiftly due to the manner of the crimes and overwhelming evidence supporting a case against this psychopath. I hope we never meet again.
One night in my house out in the country at 1 a.m, I was doing some dishes. Over the sink in the kitchen is a window that overlooks a wooden patio in the backyard, and about 5 feet away from the sink and window is a large sliding glass door to get out onto said patio. The window over the kitchen was open, but the patio door was not. It was so dark outside, and on the other side of the window screen was pure darkness. I had minimal lights on in our kitchen, but nevertheless one could definitely see my head and face in the window looking from outside. I reflected on this thought in silence, when directly ahead of me, about 10 feet of distance, I hear a cell phone ring. I freeze and stare out into the blackness of the outdoors. The cell phone continues to ring, concealed in its distance from me, but clear in its proximity. It rang maybe 3 times before slowly I hear the creaking of patio wood. One footstep, then another, then another. It was the sound of footsteps walking away from the patio slowly and onto the grass of my backyard. I heard the soft but threatening footfalls on my lawn, and the cell phone rings growing slowly fainter and more distant. Then at what seemed like at the edge of my property, the cell phone was stifled mid-ring. Silence. Silence as I stared into nothing. A nothing that was not only probably staring back at me, but I suddenly realized with horror it had been staring at me for an hour without my knowledge. Something really weird happened to me when I was house/pet sitting for my parents. The house has always weirded me out. Lots of sleep paralysis, feelings like you're being watched. Nothing super scary, but enough that I never truly felt comfortable in this home. It was late, around 1 a.m., and I'm on the computer room, chatting with a friend on AIM. This was a long time ago, and suddenly all the electronics started going off. Both TVs turned on, the stereo system turned on at full blast, the microwave and oven both started beeping. It scared the ever-loving crap out of me. My parents' dog went berserk, barking, running up and down our lower main hallway. The stereo's volume was an old dial set to 1, the lowest setting, but the music was blasting out like it had been set to the highest. I turned off everything, practically run to my room with a dog, closed the door and ignored it. But the stereo being at full volume when the dial was only set to 1 is something I have never been able to explain away.
I'm not going to lie, I've been afraid of mirrors since I was 8. I think it all started with me watching a movie of something coming out of a mirror, but I can't be sure. Even at my grandmother's house in southern Ohio, the broken dolls and movements in the shadows couldn't compare to my single, terrifying fear of mirrors. I remember running in and out of the bathroom, washing my hands with my face so close to the water that it almost naturally cleaned my face. My father used to make fun of me for being afraid of my reflection, but I didn't care. I also remember a time when me and my friend were obsessed with Bloody Mary, which may have caused some of the fear. Every day, one time or another, we would mention Bloody Mary. One time I tried it in the bathroom and I heard the unmistakable tone of an old music box coming from the mirror. I had been home alone. Even now, I have no mirrors in my room. No reflective photo frames, no uncovered windows. The only mirror I have in my home is in my bathroom. I close the door whenever possible, but I always have that brooding sense that I closed it this morning. I don't know why I feel that way, but I do. Luckily for me, I rarely have to walk close to it throughout the day, so my fear is rarely pushed to an actual scream. Because of my fear of mirrors, I naturally look unkempt. I never bothered to put on makeup. I wash my face in the shower, never closing my eyes for fear of seeing something in the mirror, or something from the mirror. For a girl, I look quite pathetic. Being made fun of for ugliness was fine, as long as I could keep away from that horrifying mirror. I heard something about mirrors that terrified me. If you looked at your reflection in darkness for more than 10 seconds, your face would distort. I found this entertaining enough to where I almost tried it. I couldn't work up the nerve to close the door, so I scratched it. No sir, I wasn't gonna tempt whatever was behind that facade. One day I was actually going to look in a mirror for a good, long time. I will admit that I would occasionally look in the mirror. It would be near impossible not to, but with the door open, lights on, and I would just think about whatever was needed to be done that day. However, today was different. I was going to face my fears. I think that is the correct term. I'm having trouble thinking correctly. I almost had second thoughts about doing it, since I'd been thinking about it all day. However terrified I was, I knew I had to do it. I turned my hallway light on, walked in the bathroom, shut the door. I let out a huge sigh, putting my hair back behind my ears, staring deep into my own horrified eyes. I put my hand on the light switch. Just as I was about to turn off the light, I knew something was wrong. My face looked scrawnier. I'm normally pretty chubby for my height, but my reflection was about the size of a 120-pound woman. I eyed it carefully and accidentally flicked the light off, even though I hadn't moved my finger. I tried to flick the light on with one hand, but to no avail. With my right hand, I frantically tried to open the door, but it was jammed. I tried breaking it down, but I couldn't. I didn't look at the mirror. I knew it had something to do with it, but I had no idea what. I sat down, a ridiculous amount of crazy-minded voices filling my head. I grabbed my head, rolling directly underneath the mirror, only being shielded from its view by the sink. I'm pretty sure I fell asleep or fainted, since my light had either blown or I don't know what, and I was in almost complete darkness. However, I could still faintly see, even with no light source visible. I wondered how long I would be in here. What if I had to look in the mirror? I decided that maybe that was the best course of action. I had my back to the mirror, took a deep breath, and turned around. Nothing was in it. I looked in close. I reached up an unsteady hand and touched it. It was ice cold. My hand went numb from touching it. After a moment of shaking my hand, I glanced back. Still nothing. The perfect reflection of my bathroom. I looked under my door. Oddly bright, despite little light going into the bathroom. Something weird was going on. I reached under the door, but my hand went ice cold once more. I sighed and laid back down. I was tough. I wasn't going to cry. I fell asleep once more. When I woke back up, my back ached. However, it wasn't as noticeable as the mirror. Someone was in it. It was almost like looking into a window. I got up and stared into it. The lights were on, the door showing a hallway behind it. It was a man, a little unshaven, talking to a police officer behind him. Dot didn't show up for work this morning. I got worried. Alice always told us when she wasn't going to be there, so I naturally got worried. She's been gone a week, right? Yeah, a week. It only seemed like a few hours. Wait, how was I seeing this? My name was Alice. My coworker. I hit the mirror once. Help, I said. He looked unfazed. I got both hands and started pounding on the mirror. Help, help. He turned to the police officer. It's a creepy mirror, ain't it? I guess. Well, we better leave. She might show up soon. I watched them leave through my bathroom, through my hallway. I was inside my own mirror. That was when I noticed my coworker's phone that he had left in the bathroom. I live in the middle of nowhere, so I don't have any signal. He's going to be back soon to get his phone. Then I'll be trapped. Just help.
When I was in the 7th grade, I wasn't stupid. I knew when someone was watching me. And I sure wasn't ugly. I was in shape from playing soccer and going to the gym to stay in shape. I wish I loved myself a bit more back then, but that's besides the point. I was very obviously underage because my face looked 10 and I wore a backpack. Plus, my school was directly next to the Starbucks where this creep worked. Since I was in a bad place back then, I kept several journal entries about my encounter with this man that can help me piece together some details and timelines of the event. But for now, let's begin. I was 12, and soon to be 13 in about 4 months. I was brand new to the area, and unlike my old school, my new school wouldn't let students in early. This was awful because school started at 8:40, and my mum would drop me off on her way to work at 7:10. It was Texas, and very humid and hot most days or pouring down with rain, and to avoid sitting outside in the awful weather, I'd have my mum drop me off at the Starbucks directly next to my school. So many middle schoolers would be there, and even some elementary schoolers, because the elementary school was connected to my middle school by a gate. So if you saw a young girl with a backpack, it was extremely obvious the girl wasn't legal. I've always been a very awkward person in new environments, so the first day my mum dropped me off at Starbucks, I was so embarrassed about filling up a seat inside that a paying customer could use, and I ended up sitting outside in the sweltering heat for an hour. I regret my decision so much to this day, because the creep had seen me out there all by myself and realized I was an easy target. He came outside and started talking to me and complimenting my long hair and beautiful face. When he asked for my name, I told him that I wasn't comfortable giving it out. After that, he made it his mission to find out my name. In the days following, I grew comfortable enough to go inside and find myself a seat. The first journal entry I wrote goes that the new school is too new and too weird. Since I first sat at Starbucks before school, the worker won't leave me alone, and that he'd been making me free drinks and randomly talking to me. I felt guilty and sick, like he was hitting on me in a way. Today he sang about me to the tune of his stupid music. When this place was busy, I snuck out. Alright, so I remember this. I walked inside the cafe and he was mopping/sweeping up a mess, and he was obviously in control of the audio because some songs I had never heard started playing. He saw me enter and began to sing, badly, about what I was wearing at the time and describing my long hair like I was Rapunzel. He had already made my usual drink and handed it to me as a few strangers watched. He knew my schedule like clockwork. Normally I sat in the corner seat that faced the register, but today I sat with my back to it so that he couldn't see my face, explaining what I meant by feeling guilty. I didn't like to accept free things from anyone, and I grew up being called spoiled by my older sister, so I grew used to telling everyone no when they offered things to me because my sister would get jealous. This is the next entry I have about him. Today was terrible. I got dropped off earlier than usual, and I was begging the worker wasn't there. But he was. He kept calling me my name, which I never told him, and he pronounces it as Jacotta. He was giving me a drink to give to my teacher, which I hate, and he also told him by name in the first place. The reason he was giving him the drink was because he told him my name. I gave him the drink back and left. So the day before, I was sitting in Starbucks, and my social studies teacher walked in wearing his lanyard and ID. This creep had been asking other teachers before about my identity, but none of them taught me and didn't know it. Well, obviously my social studies teacher would, since he taught me. And after the worker made my teacher's drink, he pointed at me and asked my name. Dakota, he said, and then left. The next day I grabbed my drink and waited the hour for class to start. As I'm leaving, the creep calls out my name, which he misheard, and I go to the counter to see what he wants. He pushes a big, hot drink towards me, and I remember being very confused about why he made me 2 drinks since I already had 1. Anyway, I liked them cold, not hot, since it was still summer. When I asked him what it was for, he told me it was to give to my teacher since he was kind enough to give my name away. I was frazzled. I gave him the drink back and left. I am glad I had written it down in my journal because my brain created a fake memory of walking down the hallway and giving my teacher the drink, which was obviously not the case. The next entry goes something like this. We all have that person we'll do anything for. Hannah. We all have that person who makes us question our sanity. My friends. We all have that person we'd never admit to ourselves we're scared of. The Starbucks worker. A few weeks later, the next entry of him goes something like this. I saw the creepy worker after school. He was outside the Starbucks talking to 2 sitting smoking ladies, standing over them and smiling. The girls had kids, and I was near the window and I couldn't stop looking at him. I didn't want him to see me. He's creepy, and I kept my hood up. This was the last of my entries, but the year I was in 8th, I still saw him frequently in passing. I knew he didn't work Wednesdays, so I would only enter Starbucks if it was Wednesday. Some other things to note. He treated me special and no one else. Once again, he knew I was a minor, and he'd frequently tell me I was beautiful. He once asked me if I wanted to know his name, but he wasn't wearing a name tag, and I wasn't about to say yes because it would have given him the wrong message. Maybe he'd have thought I was attracted to him. I wanted to know it because I wanted to warn others of him. He gave me so many free drinks, I knew damn well he was paying for them out of pocket, and he spent at least $100 on me to give me those drinks. Nonetheless, creepy guy who obsesses over a young girl, obviously underage, let's not meet again. Do any of you remember Outdoor Ed? If you don't remember, or just plain don't know, I'll give you a brief rundown. Outdoor Education, or ED for short, is a school camping trip that takes students to the woods where they can learn more about the outdoors. My Outdoor Ed's trip took me to the snow-infested mountains, and for the most part it was completely boring save for the occasional snowball fight. Then the last night occurred, and I will never forget it for as long as I live. Now before that night, I didn't have any trouble sleeping, but the last night, it was like something was wrong. At first I assumed it was just homesickness, first time away from my parents, you see. But then I looked to my cabin mates and counselor, and from the look on their face, I could tell they were feeling it too. It was a tense several minutes, and then something started calling our names. It was barely more than a whisper, but all of us heard it. The voice seductive, alluring. It made us want to go outside, but the small amount of common sense I had in the back of my head ordered me to stay put. Charlie. My counselor did not feel the same way and left the cabin to investigate. We could hear him yelling from outside. Come on, guys. This isn't funny. The kids are trying to sleep. I guess he assumed it was some sort of prank. After a few minutes of silence, he rushed back inside. There's someone out here. Stay inside. He grabbed something from his bag and left. Listen, this is your only warning. I'm armed, and if you intend to hurt these kids, I will shoot. There was silence, and I heard the loudest noise I've ever heard. 2 consecutive bangs. I could hear the other counselors come outside and hear them talk. I can't hear what they say, but my counselor comes back and says that for the rest of the night we have to stay indoors. Eventually, I slept and drifted out. Next morning, as the students are boarding the buses to leave, we see police cars on the road and police officers talking to my counselor. He described it as something barely resembling a human, taller than 10 feet, with skin so pale you could mistake it for snow. It was all he could see before he fired and the creature ran off. Suffice to say, I've had nightmares about it and am now forbidden from going on any more camping trips. Now that I'm a bit older and a little bit wiser, my best guess is that it was a Wendigo. But this was Southern California, an unusual place for such a cryptid. When I was in the 4th grade, I went to a pretty small charter school. I loved it so much. I loved every teacher I had. Our cafeteria was fairly small and we didn't have a real kitchen since the cafeteria doubled as the library. So we just got food shipped in from a caterer. Anyway, I knew almost all the cafeteria people because they were the other teachers and some of the office ladies. We had recess aides that cleaned up the tables and everything. One day there was a new guy there. He was tall. Maybe that's just because I was small. He had glasses, short hair, and seemed pretty built. He was cleaning up tables and weirdly staring at the children. You know, that just horrific feeling you get when you know something is very bad and shouldn't be happening. I had that feeling. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was going to throw up. As a child, I was very trusting and never felt this way before. It was only with this man. I ignored it, and just kind of observed him with my friend Abigail at the time. For about 2 weeks this kept happening. I'm going into the lunchroom, eat as fast as I could, and try not to make eye contact with the dude. Also, just some more detail. After we were done eating, we had to clean up our trash and then raise our hand so an aide could tell us if we could leave or not. So one day I'm done with my lunch, my friend and I raise our hands, and I'm praying he's not the one to tell us to go because I hated looking at him, as he always made me feel terrible and on edge. But lo and behold, he looks right in our direction. Usually aides are fairly lenient and would just nod their heads from across the room, but he walks slowly over to us, gets an inch away from the table, pulls out his rag and wipes it. "You left a lot of crumbs." We just stared at him because what do we say? It was his job to clean up the crumbs. We pick up our trash, but he stares at us for what felt like forever and he says, "You two are so adorable. You're like sisters with pretty blonde hair and big eyes. Like dolls." I seriously thought I was going to vomit. Then he continued, "Do you girls play with dolls? I'm sure you do. I bet you like dressing them up, huh?" You might be thinking that that was harmless or what he said wasn't that bad, but he had never spoken to a kid before, at least that I had ever seen. He didn't even speak to the other aides. He finally told us we could go and waved after leaving. I told my mum the first time I saw him, but now I ran to my teacher's classroom and told her everything. That I always had a terrible feeling about him and what he said, and Abigail backed me up saying she felt the same way. The very next day I didn't see him, and never saw him again after that. That sounds drastic, but I'm glad the school took it seriously because who knows if a kid would have gone missing or hurt by him. I'm only assuming that's what happened, but I was relieved to never have to see him again.
Tree climbing had always been one of my favorite things to do when I was little. It didn't matter how tall they were. As long as they were trees, I could climb them. My personal record for reaching the top of a tree was 60 seconds, which probably isn't that impressive, but for me at the time, I was proud of that. I lived with my grandma back then, and I'd always climb this one tree in our front yard, then swing on it for hours. But one nightmarish incident made me stay away from trees from that point on. It started out like any other day. I went out to the front yard after breakfast, ready to do some climbing as usual. I kicked off my shoes and took off my socks, since I was more adept at climbing while barefoot. Then I made my way up the tree trunk and grabbed onto the lowest branch I could. Closing my eyes, I decided to just dangle there in the air, enjoying the wind brushing against my face. After 5 minutes, I heard someone giggling below me. I looked down, and to my surprise, I saw an old woman with pale skin, dressed in a black gown, sitting at the base of the tree. At least, she looked like a woman. She was giggling while covering her face with her hands like she was playing peekaboo or something. Alarm bells should have been going off in my head right about now, but I was a very naive 8-year-old, so I didn't think she was dangerous. Instead of calling for my grandma, I asked her, "What's so funny?" while casually dangling from the branch above her. The woman looked up at me with her bloodshot eyes and smiled, like she was happy I started talking to her. Then her smile grew wider, revealing her razor-sharp teeth. "What's funny, my dear, is that in the next few seconds, I'm going to snatch you right out of that tree like a juicy, low-hanging fruit, and then I'm going to gobble you up from head to toe," she said with a soft giggle. My face went pale after hearing those words and seeing the woman's monstrous teeth. I was so scared that I just froze up, clinging to the branch a little tighter while my bare feet dangled above her head. Whoever this woman was, she clearly wasn't human. I snapped out of my daze when she stood up and began reaching for my legs with her inhumanly long arms. I quickly brought my legs up and over the branch, then started climbing for my life. The woman let out a sadistic cackle as she started climbing after me. Now, I was pretty confident in my climbing ability since I had 2 major advantages over her. I was smaller and I had bare feet. Also, you'd think she would have trouble climbing a tree at her age, but, surprisingly, she was on my heels within seconds. And I mean, she was literally snapping her teeth at my heels while I climbed, like some kind of animal. It took every ounce of concentration I had not to stumble and fall into her clutches. As I continued to climb, she'd say things like, "I'm gonna get you," and "You better climb faster, sweetie," just to scare me and make me lose my footing. But I just tuned out her words and focused on the climb. All I could hear were the soles of my bare feet slapping one branch after another as I moved with a sense of life-threatening urgency. But in spite of my efforts, I was still just a kid, so it didn't take long before I made my first mistake. While climbing, my foot slipped off a branch due to my state of panic and not getting a proper foothold on the tree. I quickly grabbed onto the trunk with both hands, then frantically moved my foot around, searching for a groove that my toes could rest on, to regain my footing. But there wasn't one. I was stuck. And in that moment, the woman didn't hesitate to try and bite my foot while it dangled in the air above her head. But thankfully, my fear kept me going and I managed to pull my foot back up in time. "So close! Almost had you there!" She'd laugh, enjoying the chase. After making it halfway up the tree, the woman suddenly got quiet, so I looked down to see if she was still there. But she was gone. Not a single trace was left of her. For a moment, I began to wonder if I'd imagined her. Suddenly, two large hands grabbed both of my ankles, pulling my feet out from under me and causing me to fall on my back. Before I knew it, I was hoisted into the air, dangling upside down by my feet. I frantically looked up to see the creature's horrifying face smiling down at me. I don't know how it reached the top before I did. I didn't even see it pass me. This thing's movements defied logic. "Told you I'd snatch you up," it said while licking its teeth. "Now to enjoy my prize." The creature then opened its mouth inhumanly wide, revealing hundreds of sharp teeth. It then slowly brought my feet up to its open maw, ready to devour me. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I kicked my legs frantically, trying to free myself, but to no avail. I was only saved when my grandma came outside after I screamed. The creature quickly dropped me before disappearing without a trace, almost as if it never existed. I got out of that tree so fast and ran straight into my grandma's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I tried to explain to her what I'd seen, but she didn't believe me. Years have passed since then, but I'll never forget that thing's face for as long as I live.
When I was 17, I worked at an indoor pool as a lifeguard. I had two very strange encounters while working at that establishment, but the one I am about to share certainly takes the cake. First, a little foreshadowing, as the details are important. I was dating a boy at the time who was chill as hell, and he had an absolutely crazy older brother. The way we met was mad. I was hanging out in said boyfriend's room, watching him play Kingdom Hearts, and one of his cousins bursts into the room and asks me to come to the bathroom immediately. A look of shock clearly plastered on his face. I got up and joined him outside the small bathroom. The thing that sticks with me the most was that I saw blood everywhere, and I mean everywhere. "You're a lifeguard, right?" the man bleeding over the sink asked me. Yeah," I replied sheepishly. "So you know first aid then?" "Of course." I don't know why, but then I kicked into training mode and began cleaning his bloodied hands to find the source of the flow. We'd sat in silence mostly. I was afraid to ask many questions. I cleaned and bandaged him up to the best of my ability. Later I found out from my boyfriend that his brother had been drinking that night, along with doing some other drugs. Apparently he got pissed off and went into full rage mode and destroyed his apartment with his bare hands. Crazy, I know. Well, one day, a pretty long time after, he saw me outside while I was over one night and approached me. I was in my car adding water, and he then proceeded to tell me he really appreciated what I did for him that night, and he had to repay me somehow. He went to my driver's side and tucked something in between the door and seat and said, "Have a good night," and that was that. I was busy with my car issues and forgot about the encounter. I honestly thought it was just some good bud, but I was wrong. It was a meat cleaver. Back to the pool now. It was late fall or early winter, therefore the pools were never too crowded this time of year, and you get to know the regulars. I was befriended by a boy maybe a few years older than me, called Jack. We had a lot in common, and despite him looking like a creep, we got on well enough. He never gave me any reason to fear him. We mostly talked about music, and he commented on how mature I was for my age compared to other girls. Again, this never alarmed me, because I heard this a lot from people. 10 years on, I still do. One day it was freezing and pouring down with rain. My shift was ending soon, and Jack had mentioned he had to walk home as his ride bailed on him. I said, "The hell you are? You live close? I can give you a lift." He agreed to wait for my shift to end and hitch a ride. He told me where he lived, and I was familiar with the community. I got changed into my clothes. I wore silly goth clothes from Hot Topic. The pants were parachute and clasped, with a snap button and zipper. We left, and I headed to the community he said he lives in. As we approached, I put my blinker on, and he said, "No, keep going." Boom. Red flag. The only thing ahead past this development were fields and the occasional farmhouse. I spoke up and said, "Dude, you said you live here." He responded that it was only a little past here, and that he used it as a landmark. Okay, fine. We kept going about 3 minutes, and after he said, "This is me on the left." I was somewhat relieved to see it was a cluster of wealthy-looking houses maybe 3 acres apart. Better than the center of nowhere, I suppose. We pulled into the driveway, and I noticed there were no cars, which I guess makes sense since he did say his ride bailed. I put the car in park, and he pulled my parking brake up. "What the?" I tried to say, but I couldn't because the creep grabbed my hair and forced a kiss on me. I forgot to mention this fool had a grill so yellow, he made Big Bird look white. Anywho, I was trying to bite him, pull away, and slap him, but he was much stronger than me. He forced his hand to the opening of my pants, and the snap betrayed me, and I was reaching to my left at this point, remembering Big Brother's gift. I screamed and told him to get off me, and whipped that sucker out so fast and slammed it into my steering wheel. It sliced into it all the way to the metal. The look on his face was priceless. He started to mumble and panic, not making much sense, and then he reached for my hand, so I pulled the cleaver out and went blindly swung it. I had no other option. I nicked the part of his hand where the thumb joins, and he yelped out in pain. "Get the hell out," I screamed, the words trembling and barely able to escape me. He hesitated, but starting to get out, and started cussing me, calling me all kinds of colourful words. I was shaking like a leaf at this point and holding back tears. He slammed my door. I put the car in reverse and tore out the driveway. Then wham, I hit something. Hard enough to stop my car. Shit, I destroyed the mailbox. In my terror, I misjudged the driveway. He came running at me, hands up and screaming at me like, "What the hell?" My window was down and I heard him say, "You're gonna pay for that." I screamed, "Shove it up your butt," or something equally colourful, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight to my boyfriend's, visibly shaken and crying at this point, and told him everything. We agreed my assault with the cleaver would cancel out police involvement, so he said he was calling his brother. I only saw Jack once more at a gas station late at night, and he just glared at me. I was with friends and begged them to leave. Haven't seen him since. So Jack, let's not meet again. Christmas Eve dinner at Burger King. Sounds innocent enough, right? Not my first choice, but I had to work late, and being Christmas Eve, it looked to be my best choice. I got finished working at 9 and had some coupons for Burger King, so that made my decision for me. When I got to Burger King, I noticed it was still open, but the dining room was shut down. The only way I could get something is if I went through the drive-thru. Only problem is I don't have a car. I tried to walk up to the drive-thru and place my order, but the compassionate young lady working the drive-thru wasn't having it. She told me if I didn't have a vehicle, I couldn't use the drive-thru. I became rather aggravated and began saying things I'm not proud of. At that moment, an older woman wearing shining armor appeared on the scene and offered me to jump into her car and order my food. At first, I turned her down, not wanting to be a bother, but after some convincing, I decided to accept her help. And after ordering my food, it took so long to get it that I missed my bus and got upset. So the nice woman offered me a ride home, and I kind of felt off-put by the offer and declined. She was persistent, but at the same time nice, and convinced me to take her offer. Mind you, I am a 250-pound 30-year-old man and really didn't feel that threatened by a 50-year-old woman. If the circumstances were different, I would have not taken the ride. After I told her where I lived, we proceeded home. About 5 minutes from my house, she made a wrong turn. I explained that I lived the other way and that we needed to turn around or let me out here, and I could walk the rest of the way. It was then that the woman's demeanor changed, and she told me that she could not let me spend Christmas Eve alone and that she was taking me to her house. I told her I needed to get home immediately to let my dog out and that I would be fine. The woman then tried to entice me with cocaine and liquor at her place, but since I'm in recovery, I told her I wasn't interested. She refused to turn around or let me out, and started to drive strangely, not stopping at stop signs, and I'm not gonna lie, my mind was racing and I began to sweat. I knew that I could physically overpower this woman, but what awaited me at her house? I also felt bad about hurting her after all her kindness, but I had to get away before her house, and I didn't know where that was, so I didn't have much time to find out. Then all of a sudden, luckily, the car in front was stopped at a stop sign, and across from it was another stopped also. She had to slow down, almost at a stop at this point, to where I made my break, jumping out of the car, still moving, and leaving my food in the car and taking off running. As I was running, she stopped, got out of the car, and began to try and talk to me into getting back in with her. That just wasn't an option. I didn't know what her motives were or who she was, but I knew I wasn't willing to risk my life over it. I ran all the way home and made sure I wasn't followed. What would have happened to me if it was 2 years earlier and I was still doing drugs and drinking? Her offer of cocaine and booze would have probably worked. Kidnapping, murder, sex trafficking, organ trading, or something else. Being a man, the thought of the vulnerability most women face every day was so foreign to me that I now understand the fear most women face. I really feel this nice woman had a nefarious purpose. Thinking about it, the ruse of such a non-threatening bait would be perfect to lower the guard of a prospective victim. Any thoughts would be appreciated. I never went to the cops because I thought they might not believe me or look down on me for being scared in this situation. What if, by not reporting this, someone else ends up hurt? Or whatever didn't happen to me happened to them? I'm a gay man of 32 and living in Southern Oregon. I have a rather large following on my nature photography Instagram and Twitter. Having a large follower count, and even sometimes a modest size count, you encounter people who push the limits into ranges that are rather inappropriate. I've had my fair share of creeps who push the limit. Most of them don't faze me. It's easy to block people and ignore them as well, and usually after a short period of time they seem to piss off. Except for one guy. I received a message one morning from a guy in Colorado. He was 24 or 25, and he seemed rather nice. He messaged me with the usual, "Hey, how you doing?" Being a down-to-earth person, I always try and respond and ask the same. Though, with the amount of messages, I cannot continue conversations with everyone, or I'd never get off the phone. But I did try my best. Usually the messages are friendly-natured or oriented quite nicely, and the occasional flirt. But after this guy got a reply from me about how I was doing, he jumped right in. "You're really hot. Where do you live? I want to know about you." I responded in a friendly capacity, saying thank you and that I was from the Pacific Northwest, keeping it vague. The conversation then changed even further. "I'd like to meet you. When can I meet you? We could be boyfriends." Then it happened, like it always does. "So how big's your member? You're top or bottom? Do you like being dominated?" Being more interested in personality first, I read his message but didn't reply. I wasn't really interested anyway. I looked over his profile, and there were little things that he would post that made me feel like I wouldn't feel comfortable talking to him, aside from him coming on really strong. Being this was on Twitter and I didn't reply, I didn't believe they sent red receipts, and I figured he'd just get the hint. A day went by, and he messaged me a few more times with more live comments. I'll admit, my Twitter is not safe for work, so I kind of expected it, and I responded him telling him thank you for the compliments, but I didn't answer his questions about the location. Again, I kept everything short and vague, and then stopped responding altogether. After a few days, he messaged me, "Are you ignoring me?" I mean, it was kind of obvious I wasn't responding, and still posting on my social media sites frequently. I eventually responded that I didn't feel comfortable with the conversation approaching, and that I don't give out my location and such. He clearly responded, rather offended, "Okay, whatever," so I blocked him. Later that night, the day I had blocked him, I got a message from another account, just random letters with the username with no posts. The message went as follows: "Why the hell did you block me? I just wanted to get with you. You're disgusting. Unblock me or you'll regret you ever did." Screw this noise, I blocked that profile too, without responding. He then sent me messages on Instagram, and using my email from my Instagram contact button emails me too. The messages were along the lines of, "I love you, unblock me or you'll regret this, I'm going to end my life," or that he would end mine. I reported these messages to Instagram, to Twitter, blocked him, took screenshots of the messages, and didn't respond to the email with the same vulgar content. He messaged me from yet more accounts telling me that he has all of my photos from IG and Twitter, and that he was going to use them to catfish people on Grindr, and that I would regret blocking him. He sends me several Grindr profiles he's created with my pictures. I talked to a friend of mine who's an attorney, and he wrote up a legal statement to send to him, "You cannot legally use my photos to impersonate me, I will press charges, etc." And I sent them to him, on yet another profile he is harassing me on. The long legal-sounding warning message that he needs to cease his actions immediately, and he responded with, "Go ahead, have fun, I'm having fun on Grindr." Then the messages got darker. He messaged me the next day, "I'll kill you, I promise you that." And another message, "I know where you live," sending me a Google Street photo of my previous address and my grandparents' house. The messages continued, "I'll hunt you down, I'll kill you. But first I'll have some fun with you for a good long time, then I'll chop you up into little pieces." I'd had enough. Being a stalker asshole is one thing, ignoring the warning cease and desist and impersonating me and threatening me is another. I called the local police department from his area, and he used his, what I assumed to be real, photos on his profiles, and I was able to find him on Facebook, although it may not have been his real name and photos, considering he had dozens of Instagrams and Facebook profiles with his name and the same photo, but with different info on each, to the tune of, "I'm a former Marine" on one, "I work with the US Marshal Service" on another, etc. Upon contacting the local Colorado Police Department from his area that he located himself, being from in his messages and profiles, the lady on the line told me there's not much they can do, as the jurisdiction would be the place the crime is committed in, my state and area, not where he is committing the crimes from. She then told me to contact my authorities and good luck. I proceeded to file a police report with my local sheriff's office here in the county of Oregon, but after a few months, have yet to even receive a response. Even after calling now, they state their cases are backed up due to COVID.
He harassed me for a few more months and I have documented it all, and I still to this day receive dozens of messages of people claiming someone is using my photos to catfish, all around the country, on Grindr. This happened around 3 years ago, when I started living alone. I moved into a really nice place. It was a corner apartment on the top floor. I loved it. My balcony was south-facing, and the windows were huge, which made for some awesome views. There was one issue though. The partition between my balcony and next door's. It wasn't very high or wide. There were big gaps between the walls and the partition as well. I could see into next door's balcony, and I guess they'd be able to do the same. Also, it didn't look that safe. Anyone could just break it down or climb it. I guess that the partition had to be like that in case of an emergency. I didn't like it all that much though. The rent was cheap, and the building was old, so I didn't care. Typical for a single man, I suppose. Now, I love all things scary, and I have a vivid imagination, so I would creep myself out imagining someone staring at me through the gaps. I didn't know why my mind did that. It never happened, by the way. The only time I'd ever seen the neighbor was an awkward interaction when we were doing our laundry at the communal laundry machines at the same time. One night, I came back from a night out drinking with my work colleagues and it was quite late. I was really tired and wanted to do nothing but sleep, but I then realized I had no clean clothes for work the next day. It couldn't be helped. I had to get the washing done. I felt like an idiot and a really terrible neighbor, since it was going to make a lot of noise with me going back and forth to the laundry room. When the laundry was done, I went to put out all of it on the clothesline to dry outside. It was a cold night, but there was enough wind to dry my clothes. As I was walking to the balcony door, a thought came creeping back into my mind. Is someone going to be out there, hiding, staring at you? For some reason, I imagined a woman soaked in blood. When I saw her face in my mind's eye, I shuddered. I knew that there would be no one out there, though. How could there be? It was just my imagination, though, right? I stepped out onto the balcony and forced myself to look through the gaps into the partition to put my mind at ease. There was no one there. Relieved, I went about my business, but then stopped in my tracks when I heard something. The sound of something scratching. It was very jaunty in the quiet of the night, especially since my imagination was running away with me. The scratching sound was loud. I wondered if it could perhaps be a hanger in the wind. I listened a little closer and realized it could not be a hanger scraping against something. It didn't sound metallic. It sounded like someone scratching their nails on a piece of wood. A horrible chilling wind had begun to blow, and despite the cold, I realized I was sweating. I hated that I scared myself. I told myself that it was just my neighbor, and they were just out on the balcony at the same time I was. I then looked for myself through one of the gaps in the partition, and I noticed that the lights were off. The strange scratching sound continued. I was standing there thinking, at the age of 30, I had finally experienced something paranormal. The thought profoundly frightened me. I knew that I would have to turn and pass the gap in the partition to return to my apartment. It was like some horrible test of courage. I turned to go back inside, and I knew the second I turned towards the gap, I would see something. Perhaps that woman. It sounds like I'm making something out of nothing, but there really was something strange out on the balcony at night. The vision of a blood-stained woman leapt to the forefront of my mind again. I hated my imagination. Why was the image so prominent? How long did I stand there frozen, unable to think of anything beside the image? 5, 10 minutes? I couldn't tell you. However long it was
It was long enough for me to realize that the scratching sound had stopped. The balcony was now silent. I felt relieved and I blamed myself for overthinking. I was working myself up over nothing. Perhaps there was no ghost, no neighbor hiding. Maybe it was just an animal, or a gust of wind. I had talked myself down from overreacting, and just as I was mentally telling myself off for watching too many horror films, I heard a large thud against the partition. It was horribly loud. My heart stopped for a moment. Someone was there. They had to be. My intuition was right. My eyes were then fixed at the location of the sound and I couldn't move. I couldn't see anything through the gap. That is when I saw a jet black hand slowly wrap its hand around the outside of the balcony partition, and a head slowly crept around the corner and stared at me. I couldn't see through its hair in the darkness of the night, but it was there. It was horrifying to realize I wasn't alone, after all my suspicions. It was staring at me. It was so horrible. I burst into my room, pulled the door shut and locked it and closed the curtains. I left my apartment and stayed with a friend that night. I don't think I returned to my place for at least a week. Thank goodness for good friends, huh? He even went back to my place to retrieve some things. Even though it felt so real, I still try and tell myself it could have been some sort of hallucination. The horror of having your worst fears confirmed in the dead of night is something I wish upon no one. Or perhaps the hallucination theory is easier and more comforting to believe, or perhaps just makes the incident easier to forget. Days or weeks after that night, I forget which, I went to speak with my neighbor. His son was at university, and he told me that in the past he had complained to the building management. He said it sounded as if people were on his balcony every night. He thought it was someone trying to break in, but he couldn't be sure, as there was never anyone there. It was almost comforting to know that I wasn't alone in my experience. I thought my experience was bad, but the neighbor seemed to have had it worse. Whatever was going on was on their balcony after all. That's as far as my story went. All I can tell you is I left the apartment and haven't lived in an apartment with a balcony since, as these experiences haunt me to this day.
About 2 years ago, I had a quite nice and strange
I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and facilities. Before the current hospital I work at, I worked at a geriatric hospital 30 minutes from my house. I had experience working with older patients before, so this was nothing new to me. I had been working at this hospital for only a couple of weeks, and you'll soon understand why. This was on my second to last shift at this hospital, unbeknownst to me at the start of that night. I was working the graveyard shift, and I was running on negative hours of sleep. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward absolutely adored me. My presence as a young girl in her 20s among the residents of this ward who were otherwise left to themselves to float around in their minds, I'm sure saw me as a breath of fresh air, someone who could tie them to the now or to the everyday. If you're just left to yourself, you can mentally go to other places, but with someone else in your space, you're tied to that moment in time. I was dealing with a number of patients that night, but one was a little more restless than the others. Her name was Lena. This was my first night dealing with her, and she kept telling me anytime I'd enter her room about the voices she kept hearing and the man dressed in black she kept seeing in the corner of the room. The other lady in her room requested her curtain be closed before my shift started so that Lena would leave her alone. She was a sweet lady that smiled whenever I was around her, but she didn't say much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 9 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by 11, but not Lena. Whenever she called me into the room, she'd be frightened of these alleged voices she was hearing, and the man in black that kept staring at her in the corner of the room. Not gonna lie, it was creeping me out a little. I believed that in her mind she was seeing and hearing these things, and I sympathized with her because I imagined them to be very scary. But still, I tried my best to calm her down and get her to go to sleep. I didn't want to turn on the TV to calm her down because I wanted to be courteous of the other patient in the room. I held Lena's hands and told her it's okay, to breathe and to relax. I reminded her that she wasn't here alone, and I was always just a call away. This seemed to do the trick. Lena relaxed for a while, and the next time I came in the room, she was asleep. Once most, if not all, of the patients are asleep, the night goes much slower. Time almost moves in reverse. An hour or two later, I was in the linen room stocking my cart when I heard something in the room. It was a relatively small, dead quiet room. I had the door closed too. That's why hearing another noise was weird. I turned, saw nothing, and resumed stocking my cart. Then I felt what I can only describe to be a hand on my shoulder. I looked at my shoulder, jumped, and screamed, but there was nothing on my shoulder. There was no one in the room. Yet I knew I felt something large basically grab my shoulder. I went out in the hall for a second to peek my head. No other nurses in sight. Dead quiet. I had nothing else to do but resume what I was doing. I continued stocking the cart until it was full. Then I turned to face the door, and I fell to the floor and started screaming as my heart was immediately in my throat. There was a man dressed in black standing outside the door, looking through the glass, smiling. My screams were loud enough to wake the entire ward. The man disappeared out of sight through the glass window of the door. Seconds later, the door opened and one of my fellow nurses came in to help me off the floor as I was hysterical. I asked her if she saw the man dressed in black. Her response was, "What man? There's no one else here." We checked all the rooms in the ward. There wasn't anybody dressed in black in there. My screams woke Lena from whatever light sleep she must have been in, and when I came into her room, she started talking of the voices. This time the screams, which she didn't know were my screams. I asked her what this man in black looked like, if he was smiling. And she looked at me, and I noticed her eyebrows point down, as her expression changed to look the most focused I'd seen her the entire day. She asked, "How did you know?" And even with my heart still racing, I felt it skip a beat as she said this. She started screaming now, screaming, "Get me out of here, he's coming." The other nurses came in and tried to calm her down. I was switched to a different ward that night with someone else, and I eventually ended up going home early because I was just so freaked out. I texted the head nurse the next day that my next shift would be my last, that the experience traumatized me and that I didn't really want to be in that building anymore. I've never been diagnosed with anything, nor have I ever dealt with hallucinations of any kind. I'm aware of the effects of lack of sleep, but this was next level. I don't know if my mind started playing tricks on me from what Lena was telling me all night, but the feeling of the hand on my shoulder, the image of the smiling man behind the glass door, matching the description a patient kept giving multiple times. This was one of those once-in-a-lifetime, unexplainable supernatural occurrences. At least, I hope it was once in a lifetime. 3 years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida. I don't believe there was an outbreak going on or anything, so I'm not sure how I caught it or who I could have caught it from. I started developing really bad symptoms, painful headaches, confusion, sleepiness, nausea, and lack of appetite. But when the hallucinations started, that's when I knew I had something really serious. Laying sick in bed while my husband was at work, I heard a child's voice call Mom from downstairs. We don't have any kids. I dragged myself out of bed to look down the stairway to call my husband's name. Of course, he didn't answer because he was at work. The headache I had from standing was too much, so I went back to bed. For a second time, I heard a voice call from downstairs. It said hello.
Hello.
I picked up the phone and called my husband, freaking out to him into the phone that I was hearing a scary child's voice from inside the house, and that I thought I was hallucinating. He heard how distressed I was over the phone, and so he left work early to bring me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I changed out of my pajamas, and while doing so, I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. As I was mid-throwing up, I heard another voice from outside of the bathroom. I couldn't hear what it might have said, nor could I tell if it sounded the same as the other voice I heard. I was losing my mind. I wasn't diagnosed until I arrived at the hospital, and apparently, if untreated, what I had could be very serious, even fatal. The doctor told me the hallucinations part was rather unusual, but not unheard of. I was given antibiotics through a needle shortly after I arrived at the hospital with my husband. The doctor told me that I was fortunate to have come to the hospital so quickly, as if I had waited much longer, this could have had lasting effects or possibly have been fatal. My husband stayed with me for a few hours in the room. I was told I was going to have to stay there for a few days to a week, given the severity of my symptoms. Around 10 o'clock, my husband left to go home, as he had work the next day. The nurse told me call her if I should have any issues. Though I still felt like absolute death, I nodded off pretty quickly. I started having this dream where my ex-husband was in the room, over my bed, looking down at me, talking. He was saying horrible things about my current husband. He patted my head and said he was glad I was okay, and that he came as soon as he saw my husband left. He went into this rant about how he despises my current husband and wants to kill him. He kept rubbing my forehead, then left the room. I often have bad dreams about my ex-husband because of how toxic and abusive our marriage was, and why it ended, which I'd rather not include. I woke up in this drowsy, lightheaded state and looked around the room. There was a chair pulled up in front of my hospital bed, but no one was sitting in it. It wasn't like that when my husband left. It was still the middle of the night, so I went back to sleep. I woke up the next morning to the nurse in the room. I told her about the weirdly vivid dream I had, and she laughed and told me that wasn't a dream, that my cousin came to visit me last night. I told her I don't have any cousins that live in this state. She looked more serious now and said, "Well, someone who said they're your cousin David visited you late last night." David was the name of my ex-husband. After explaining better, the nurse got a doctor, and the doctor told me the antibiotics may have caused delirium, which hindered my ability to recognize sleep from wakefulness, hence why I was so vividly hearing what David was saying. I called my husband to tell him what happened, and of course he was livid and concerned. He came back again that night after work. But that day, I texted David, asking what the hell he was thinking visiting me, and how did he know I was in the hospital. My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent a follow-up, telling him I heard all of his threats towards my husband and that I'd be getting police involved. And minutes later, he responded saying, "I never made any threats towards your husband. I was simply there when I heard what happened to make sure you were okay. You must have heard things in your sleep." I responded, "Stay out of my life or I'll get police involved again." He didn't respond after this. I never told my husband about the threats I heard in my drowsy half-asleep state, because I didn't know if they were real or not. With a mix of the antibiotics and my already having weird audible hallucinations the day before, I don't think it's impossible that what I heard wasn't actually what was said. But I could be wrong. I left the hospital the next week. I used to work in a 24/7 general store in a mall in South Carolina, so while the mall itself would close around 9:30, our store would stay open all night. There were two entrances to the store, one from inside the actual mall itself, and then a back door that people could enter through after the mall closed. Past 9:30, I would always have to shut the gate, separating the store from the mall. Given that this was a smaller store, it was never really busy in the deep night hours, which also made my job very uneventful most of the time. But there was one night shift that turned out to be anything but uneventful. It was towards the middle of my shift. The gate between the store and the mall was down, but I could still see through it obviously into the dark half-lit hallway of the mall. The mall always had night lights on, which were much dimmer but bright enough for the security guards to see what's going on in the cameras. I was doing my own thing, organizing the shelves, making sure everything was neat, when I heard a rattle at the metal cage. I looked and saw some guy standing on the other side, grasping the gate with his hands. At first, I thought it was a security guard on duty. It was the only logical explanation, even though it was rare to ever see them walking around. But as I got closer and asked if there was a problem, I realized it wasn't a security guard. It was just some random man. He was wearing a dirty black and white plaid shirt and very baggy blue jeans. Most notably though, and what made this exceptionally strange, was that he was just looking up at the ceiling. I inched a little closer and again asked if something was wrong and if he needed help, but he just kept looking up and shaking the gate. Now, there was some kind of protocol I was supposed to follow in the case of something like this in order to get the mall security. However, I didn't know how. I didn't know what number to dial, I didn't know how to work any kind of intercoms, so all I could really do was shut it out. I turned my back to the creepy man and went back to my register behind the counter, as far away from him as possible. Unfortunately, the shelves are angled perpendicularly to the counter, not parallel, so the man at the gate was in direct line of sight from me still. He finally seemed to back away. Like literally walked backwards though, with his head still up at the ceiling. All that was going through my mind was where could security be? It was to my understanding that there would be at least one person watching the cameras at night. Anyway, I tried to just move past it, resuming my cleaning activities. I couldn't help but look back outside to the mall every once in a while though. Thankfully, he was gone now. Eventually, someone came into the shop. I heard the back door slide open. I was in between two shelves and couldn't see them, so I continued with my work. After finishing up sweeping the aisle, I went back to the register to wait for the customer. I saw the customer now. They were standing at the end of the last aisle to the left, the alcohol aisle. He was looking up. At first I thought he was looking at the top shelf, so I looked away. I only looked at him for maybe a second. I bent down under the counter to put the broom and dustpan underneath, and when I stood back up to look at the customer, I felt like my heart nearly stopped. He was looking at me with a smile, not a grin, but a wide-lipped smile. It also sank in right away now that this was the same man that was out in the mall from earlier, only now he'd apparently taken off his black and white plaid shirt. I stared at him and he stared at me, and I think this went on for 30 seconds. I didn't know what to do, and I had actually frozen up in fear. The face he gave, the smile, was a pure look of horror, something straight from a horror film or someone's nightmares. I felt like he stared into my soul. I opened my mouth to speak, and my voice trembled. I think I said, "Get out or I'm calling the cops." He didn't move. He didn't even bat an eye. I ran to the back room and locked the door so I could call my manager. She wouldn't pick up after several attempts though. When I gave up, I heard a tap at the door. Not a knock, just a very gentle tap. I sat like a nervous wreck in that back room for a good 5 minutes, wanting to be anywhere but there. But when the fear of this person stealing a bunch of items and losing my job became greater than the actual fear of the person, I stepped back outside and looked around. But the man was gone. He was gone for good this time. Our shop has cameras, so they caught all of it. When my shift ended, I told my manager about what happened and showed her the video footage. She was shocked and kind of freaked out herself. I only worked there for another month after that, then moved on. For the past 3 years or so, I've worked as an overnight security guard at a mall. It used to be that the mall didn't require an overnight person, but vandalism started to become a problem. Most of the time I would drive around the parking lot all night listening to my car radio. Now and then I'd kick some skateboarders out of the parking lot or investigate a suspicious person lurking about. Other than that, I'd say the job was pretty tame. Maybe 3 months in, I experienced something a little bit stranger. I noticed that the light to one of the shops was on while driving around the parking lot. This was surprising to me considering no one had snuck past me as of yet. So of course I parked the car and headed inside the mall to catch the potential thieves. As I approached the shop, I didn't hear the sound of anyone rummaging through the inventory. Sure enough, the shop was empty. As a matter of fact, even the security gate was still down. Only the shop owners had access to the security gates, so I couldn't really do anything about the light being on. I headed back out to my car. I'd say an hour went by with no incident, but as I was circling around the entrance to the mall, I saw another light was on inside. Inside the mall, it was the same scene repeated. The light was onto the shop, but the security gate was still closed. I even tugged on the damn thing to see if someone heard me coming and just hid from me. Nope, it was locked. I heard a click from behind me while investigating. The previous light was no longer on. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear I saw someone run behind the counter and hide. I think about now is a good time to mention I was running on 3 hours of sleep for the past 48 hours, and I was blaming these occurrences just simply on the lack of sleep. I shined my flashlight into the shop and scanned the area. Nothing that I could see. Behind me was another click. Once again the light to the shop was off, and this time I know I saw someone standing in there. So I simply called out, "You can either leave with me or you can leave with the police." They didn't move, just stood next to the light switch. I approached the gate and turned my light in the direction of the light switch, and there was no one standing there. I did see that a clothes rack was fairly close to the switch, so maybe the light was catching the clothes just right and was casting a shadow. That was the most logical explanation I could think of, at least. I left the mall. I was pretty spooked from the events of that night, but after a few months, they were pretty much out of my mind. My patrols were nothing special for a while after that. I think my next incident happened around my 1-year anniversary as a guard. It was winter and I was inside of the mall checking the pipes. Yes, I was on security duty, but the owners decided to save a buck by having me inspect certain things as well. It was whatever. I was heading to one of the bathrooms to relieve myself when I heard a toilet flush. I jumped a little more than I would like to admit. Inside of the bathroom, I didn't see anyone. The toilets in the mall were motion activated, much like every other mall in the world. I checked all of the stalls, empty. I'll spare you the details, but after checking the stalls, I took a seat in one of them. I had a YouTube video playing on my phone while I was sitting. Then I heard a tapping sound coming from the stall next to me. I glanced to my left and saw a pair of shoes standing with the toes pointing towards me. Slowly, I brought my eyes up above the stall. Sure enough, there was the tallest man I'd ever seen standing over the stall, staring down at me. Had I not already been on the toilet, I would have been running home for new pants. When he saw me notice him, he ducked back down beneath the stall. I hopped up and kicked in the door to the neighboring stall. The damn thing was empty, except for a pair of shoes sitting in the same spot I had seen them. My heart was thumping like crazy. I went back to my car as quickly as possible after that. If I remember correctly, this happened at around 4 in the morning. Once again, I accredited all of this to my lack of sleep. I was just happy that I had the next day off.
Y'all remember that thing, Omegle? I don't know if it's still as popular as it used to be, or if there's just another version of it that people use, but for those that don't know, it's a website that puts you in a completely random, one-to-one chat room with people, either just text or with webcams too. When I was in my final year of high school, me and my buddies thought it was like the greatest thing ever after we talked 3 rando girls into flashing us one night. So as thirsty as it sounds, that's all we did for like a whole summer. Just chilling in one of our friends' mom's basements and just burning through different people all night. It got to the point where I'd go on Omegle sometimes when I got bored at home. Not to talk to girls as such, just to kind of mess around and see who was online. But I don't go anywhere near that site anymore. Not after seeing the most messed up thing of my life on there. Something that reminded me that the internet is still a pretty dark place sometimes, and that sometimes you can just happen across something seriously messed up, just on accident. So I have my webcam on, and I'm on a roll of just closing chat after chat. Everyone on that night was either a dude playing with themselves, a lonely weirdo, or someone legit mentally deficient, and I was just about to close that browser window out of sheer boredom when I see something that catches my eye. It's a girl, kneeling in a room lit solely with red lights. My first thought is that I might have gotten lucky, and that I was in for a little bit of a show. But then I saw the plastic sheet underneath her. Now, as crazy as it sounds, I had seen something like that before, when this older woman in a mask had a plastic sheet down and was urinating on whatever the stranger in the chat asked them to. Me and the guys had a good laugh at that one, but it was obvious that the idea was to make us laugh at that time, or some other strange interests. But what I ran into that night was most definitely not designed to be humorous. I'm still watching it, wondering who this girl is, why she isn't wearing a mask when she's basically completely uncovered. Whatever was about to happen, though, she sure seemed nervous about it, like she was visibly shaking and trying her best to hide her face, not that she was doing a good job of it. It seems really dumb in retrospect, like the whole thing was giving off the worst vibes, but my dumb horny brain has me still thinking that this is some kind of weird fetish, and for some reason, when this masked dude appears on screen, that just cemented it for me. Some kind of weird BDSM thing was about to go down, and I wasn't mad that I was going to be the rando person to get to watch it. The dude walks up to the girl and puts a black bag over her head. She squirms a little, but other than that, I think she's still just nervous. Or maybe she was acting like that as a show for the audience. I mean, heck, maybe the dude liked her to act like that, who knows? People are weird. The dude then disappears from view before reappearing with a cordless drill. He makes a show of this, having a finger on the tip of the drill like a magician would all, "This is a real blade" type thing, and then walks around the back of the girl and grabs her by the head. Only then do I start to realize that this isn't quite what I thought it was, and that maybe, just maybe, I should close the freaking chat before I see something I end up regretting. But there was something about the whole scene, something about the way the guy was acting and how the girl didn't try to run away. It seemed like a setup, like it was designed to freak someone out. Even the red lights were sus, like I remember reading about how old Italian horror movies would tactically use red lights on set to disguise how terrible their fake blood looked. Something about it meant I couldn't look away. So, I was watching as this hulking, bare-chested dude grabs the girl by the head. She's tiny too, and the size difference means his hand is basically wrapped around her entire skull. He then fires the drill up twice to ensure it's working properly, and that's when the girl really starts to panic. It was also, coincidentally, the moment I started to panic too. Either this girl was doing a very good physical acting job, or her fear was real. And if her fear was real, it meant the whole thing was real too. She starts flailing and struggling so hard that the monster holding her had to lock a knee into the small of her back to keep her still. The way they fell, you could basically only see her head and her legs kicking behind them both. Like I said, I was almost certain the whole thing was fake, but the part that made me really doubt that was what happened to the girl's legs when the guy started to push the whirring, spinning drill into the back of her head. First of all, there was the noise. It was absolutely stomach-churning. The sound of what could easily have been metal on bone just grinding against each other. But that could be faked, right? And there was this horrible mix of screaming and the drill's motor whirring, and the girl grunting as the pain started to hit. But again, could all be acting at the end of the day. What I'm almost certain you can't fake is the way this girl's legs started to spasm when the guy pinning her down started to really push that drill into her brain. They moved in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before, almost like people act in cartoons when they're being electrocuted. I got this sick feeling in my stomach, and I immediately closed the chat window before I saw anything else. The whole thing left me really shaken up. Everyone I've explained what I saw to says they think it was faked too. But then again, I'm almost certain that's because I feed them so much info on how it could have been fake and not really on all the reasons why I think it could have been real. I think I actually just want people to tell me that. Tell me, stop freaking out. You fell for some elaborate prank that'll end up on the internet elsewhere. Because the alternative is just way too messed up for me to quantify, and a part of me still does think that I actually did watch a live snuff film that afternoon. I want to tell you guys that I later heard the cops found a body with a drill hole in the back of the head, or even that I read somewhere that it was just a prank, or even a weird kind of viral marketing campaign or something. But the truth of the matter is, I just don't know. I never heard anyone else talk about the kind of thing I saw on Omegle that day, and I didn't ever go on that site again, so I didn't give myself a chance to catch a repeat performance, so to speak. I just try and tell myself that what I saw wasn't real, and that it was just an elaborate show to scare random internet strangers. That's what keeps the darker thoughts at bay when I'm reminded of it, and that's what helps me get to sleep at night. For a few years there, Omegle and chat roulette were the best things ever. I know it sounds dumb, but the idea of coming face to face with random internet people absolutely terrified me at first. I wasn't the most confident of people when I was younger, and believe it or not, using stuff like Omegle actually helped me come out of my shell a little and learn how to talk to people. And naturally, like anyone who spent a lot of time on Omegle, I have a lot of stories detailing some of the weirder encounters I've had on there. I mean, I've had some pretty amazing ones. I met one of my long-term gaming buddies on Omegle, and you'd be surprised at the number of girls who just want to show themselves off, so to speak, every once in a while. But I've also had my share of gross, sad, irritating, and downright scary encounters on Omegle too. And what I'm about to tell you is by far the most disturbing. And it's not some dumb creepypasta either. Every word of this is true. So I just gotten home from this terrible part-time job I was working in 2012, and at the time, my routine was like, get home, sneak one of my stepdad's beers from the garage, and see how palpable the mental illness was on Omegle that afternoon. I was actually having a good run at one point. I had a guy singing that Call Me Maybe song, another dude who did a magic trick, and a handful of pretty girls, and I think one dude was on acid or something. So all in all, I was in a pretty good mood by the time I hit end and knew for what turned out to be the final time of that night. Because when I do, I just see this dude sitting at his desk, staring blankly into the webcam. Immediately this hits me as unusual because most people are looking at their screens to see who you are and not straight up staring into the camera. I said like, "Hey, what's up?" or something. But the dude didn't reply, so I figured that there was just something wrong with his audio. Now I should add that it was usually around this time that I'd just end a chat and start a new one. If the person on the other end seemed too weird or like they wouldn't be much fun, I'd just skip them entirely. So as you can imagine, coupled with all the other weird stuff you're likely to see during an Omegle session, I ended up doing a lot of skipping. But something about this dude really got my attention. At first, when I saw him, he looked like he might be in his early to mid-teens, dark hair and eyes, kind of a baby face with scrawny shoulders. But the more I looked, the older he seemed to be. The guy had crow's feet, deep bags under his eyes, pretty sure he had flecks of gray at his temples too. Like if he was as young as I thought he was, then he must have had the most brutal paper route in history. So for some reason, at a time I'd normally just ghost him, I said, are you okay, dude? Can you hear me?" He nods. He could hear me, and it hit me that this might be another case of someone browsing Omegle while they're high. It might sound a little mean or whatever, but I figured that I'd just mess with him just a little bit. Maybe see if I could guess what kind of drug he was taking. I start talking real slow to him, trying to make him think time is slowing down or something, but he barely reacts. And it's then that I realize that he hasn't looked at his screen or monitor. The whole time, he was literally just staring at this little lens on his webcam. I break from the play acting and just ask him straight up, "What kind of stuff are you on, dude?" He just shakes his head. So I ask him if he means he isn't on any drugs at all, and to that he nods. Now I'm torn between laughing because of what could have been a blatant lie and kind of freaking out because if he wasn't lying, and that was him sober, that made for one real creepy guy. And then out of nowhere, this guy reaches up towards his mouth like he's about to take out some gum or something. At first, I think he's going to show me some weird root he's been chewing on that made him look all sleepy. I mean, if there is such a thing, I was just kind of speculating. I know people can get some pretty weird South American plants and stuff from shady websites. But then it becomes obvious that he has hold of his own tooth. His front tooth, I think. Like in the grip of his thumb and forefinger. And then he starts to pull. I respond, "Dude, what are you doing?" All calm at first. And then he starts really getting a grip on his tooth, pulling it and twisting it. And I respond, Stop! What are you thinking, man?" This all escalates until I hear like a deep cracking sound coming from this guy's mic. He twists the tooth free from his gum as blood starts to pour out of his mouth, then holds it up to the camera like he's all proud of himself. I am full-on squealing at the computer at this point, stuck between wanting to cover my eyes and turn it off, and not being able to look away because of what this guy is even doing. I asked him in like 100 different ways, "Why did you do that? Was it rotten? Can't you go to the dentist? He doesn't say a word. He just spends a few more seconds smiling with this gap-toothed grin, mopping at the blood on his chin and holding up the tooth in front of the webcam. Then he disappears and I'm left on the new chat screen, just shell-shocked. Nothing has ever topped that for me in terms of just pure creepiness. Like I have so many unanswered questions about that guy, and each time I think I get close to figuring it out, it just opens me up to 100 other questions. I mean, he would have had to have been on drugs to be able to pull his own tooth out like that. I don't think anyone could stand the sheer agony. And it's also the whole idea that it wasn't his first time doing it. As crazy as it sounds, he seemed to just know what he was doing. That he had to twist it and wrench it. He knew exactly how to grip it. And then the sense of pride at the end. It all just gave me this distinct feeling that he'd done that kind of thing before. I didn't see anything else that ever made me react so strongly, and after that, all the random guys just sort of playing with their junk that you'd see didn't seem to faze me at all. Like as long as there wasn't any tooth pulling, it was just water off the duck's back. So, I guess I have something to thank Mr. Tooth Puller for, although saying that it's not something I want to see again. In fact, I hope I never meet Mr. Tooth Puller online, or in real life, ever again.
Snapchat was still pretty new when this story took place. It was sometime in late 2011. During my freshman year of high school, I had one really close friend. Her name was Samantha. Samantha told me one Friday before the weekend that she would ask for a friend request the next day. She thought it would be really cool if we bandwagoned on the Snapchat trend. The sooner the better, because Snapchat was almost non-existent at our school. And when I got home that day, I got a friend request. The profile picture was of Samantha. This was odd because she told me that she would invite me to her contacts the next day. Without hesitating, I accepted it. I figured she just got to it sooner. After I finished my homework the same day, I got a message from that account. 2 messages, in fact. They said, "Come to my house tomorrow, we can have a party." And the second was her address. I was really happy as I never went to her house before. We had just met earlier that year. And besides that, I wasn't often invited to parties. The address she gave me was to a house nearby, so I decided to walk over the next day. When I actually saw the house, I checked Google Maps multiple times to make sure I was led to the right destination, because this place was very messy and the windows were covered in those thank you bags you get at markets. Something didn't seem right. It was very modest for Samantha's family, yet we attended a private school. I realized the address was correct, so I knocked on the door, although I was a bit hesitant. It opened very quickly, and a man greeted me, almost like he was expecting me. He was about 6'3" with blonde hair. He really didn't look anything like Samantha, who was a short, black-haired girl. I asked if they were related. He simply said, "Yes." It was in a very plain and odd voice. Then I asked him about the bags on the windows, and he said it was because construction workers were still renovating the house. Before I could ask or say anything else, he beckoned me inside, moving aside so I could go through the doorway. I entered the small house. Sitting near a frayed couch was a large terrier, which he said they just bought a few days before I arrived. He told me to sit down while he went to get something. I checked the time on my phone, but the moment I grabbed it, it vibrated with a message. It was a notification from Snapchat. It was Samantha. It said, "Here is my Snapchat." And I thought things couldn't get weirder. She'd already sent me a request. Did she make another profile? Why would she do that? So immediately, as confused as I was, I messaged her back. "Your house is so weird. Where are you?" I said. "House?" she asked. "I have an apartment." My heart sank in my chest. Surely she was pulling my leg, just making a joke on me or something, I thought. "That's not funny," I messaged back. "Your dad's home. Where are you?" She didn't answer for a few seconds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got an answer. An answer that confirmed everything. "What are you talking about?" it said. "My mom's been single for a while. I'm waiting for you by the door. Where are you?" I lower my phone, eyes wide and breathing funny. What do I do? Did I really just walk into a stranger's house? A stranger that had laid bait for me? That's when I hear whispering from another room. The man stepped out of the room with 2 other men. One was holding a thick black bag with his hands. Fully assuming the worst, I sprinted out of the house as fast as I could. Not once did I look back, even as I heard the footsteps behind me. Eventually, they faded away. I didn't stop running until I got back home, until I was inside the house with the doors locked. Once I finally got a breather, my chest never burned so bad before. My mom and dad looked worried when they saw me, and they needed an explanation. In between breaths, I tried to tell them. They got the gist of it, and they called the police. When the police got there, they were gone. That house had been abandoned. There should have been no one living there.
So here are the events that have transpired in the past 2 hours or so, and a little backstory as to why this is freaking me out so much. My partner and I have recently moved back into my childhood home with my parents, while our own house is being built to save some cash and not have to move instantly from our rental when it's complete. My parents own 3 Australian native birds, and earlier tonight I was updating my Snapchat story to show my friends, as many of them always ask what the birds' names are and what they look like. I took 3 Snapchat videos, one after the other, and just put them on my story without worrying about retakes or what I look like, so please forgive me for the uploads. Anyways, within about 15 minutes of uploading, I received an SMS message from one of my good, but not great friends that said, "You bearded beasts, those birds are mad. By the way, the fuck was that in your window behind you in the last one?" I had no idea what he was going on about, so I went and watched my own Snapchat stories a couple of times. On the 3rd or 4th watch, I saw what he was talking about, and my stomach sank. I almost started to have a panic attack, and I'm still pretty shaken up. I immediately saved my story videos and put them onto my computer to see them larger. In the last Snapchat video I sent, it kind of looks like someone is at the door, looking in, with their hands cupped against the door. It's hard to tell because Snapchat videos are very poor quality and the door is only in frame for probably 1 second. Whatever is in the 3rd Snapchat video, however, is definitely not in the first video when the door is in full view. I was the only person home at the time, and that particular door leads to the backyard, which is only accessible via a single locked gate. Here are the 3 videos I saved from my story.
Right, so the first one of my parents' little birds is this little guy. It is little Leo. He's a cockatiel. The second little bird of my parents is a rainbow lorikeet. His name is Oliver. And there he is. And here I am with my good little mate, Puffin.
To add some backstory as to why this has me freaking out so much, to do that, I have to quickly talk about my childhood teenage years up until I moved out with my partner at age 18. From about age 8 until age 10, I had episodes of sleep paralysis, 1 or 2 times a month, where it felt like a weight was sitting on my chest and I couldn't breathe for about 40 seconds at a time. This led to insomnia and anxiety about bedtime, as I dreaded feeling helpless. I ended up seeing a child psychologist, and whether that was or was not the reason, the episodes largely went away, only once or twice a year until age 13. At age 12 or 13, for seemingly no reason at all, I started to get chronic episodes almost every night that lasted minutes to tens of minutes at a time. During these episodes, I could breathe, but couldn't move. The worst thing about these episodes, however, is that I felt like something was in the room with me and meant me no harm, common for people who experience sleep paralysis. At roughly age 14, things really took a turn, and I started to hear and see things during maybe 1 in 10 of my episodes, also pretty common for people who experience sleep paralysis. The things I heard were never too crazy and over the top, and were usually just thuds and creaks. However, when it came to seeing things, there was always one reoccurring thing: a faceless person looking into my bedroom window with their hands cupped to the glass. For the course of a 1 to 10 minute episode, this person would just stand there and look at me. Whenever the episode ended, the person would just be gone. Over the course of 4 years, this occurred quite regularly, but it always really made me feel totally helpless and terrified. I never got used to it. When I moved out at age 18, I never had another episode where I saw anything. I'm 26 years old now, and I very, very occasionally, once a year, have small, less than 30-second episodes, but only those in which I feel heavy-chested. To cut a very long story short, whatever is there in my Snapchat video looks almost 100% what I used to see as a teenager during my sleep paralysis episodes, and I have been a nervous wreck all night over it. To me, it kind of looks like a face to the glass and 2 hands on either side. It has scared the Christ out of me. What do you guys think? I'll try to answer as many questions as I can and respond to everyone that I can. Thanks a lot, guys. I went to university in a small town, less than 5,000 people. The majority of the population is made up of students, but of course there are also locals. I never had a problem with any of the locals before, but they could be a tad strange. So about 7 months ago, I was at the grocery store around 6 p.m. buying food for dinner. I was in the dairy aisle looking for cottage cheese. We were making lasagna. When, from behind me, this man asked me why I was buying cottage cheese. I turned around, and there was a man standing there, probably in his late 40s, early 50s, with long greasy ponytail and dirty clothes. Something about him made me feel uncomfortable. However, I'm very polite and a little too nice, so I engaged in the conversation with him. I'm making lasagna tonight and the recipe calls for it. I'm a professional chef. Let me tell you that you should not be using cottage cheese. You should be using ricotta, he says. So I said thanks for the advice and picked up the ricotta. I was about to walk away when he continued conversation. He was going on about really weird things, like how he used to have a white tiger as a pet. I thought he was delusional, and how he makes homemade hot sauce out of his house. At this point, I had probably been standing there listening to him for 20 minutes. Do you like hot sauce? Yeah, sometimes. You should come to my place and make hot sauce with me. I just live up the mountain. No thanks. It's okay. The man starts getting really pushy and trying to persuade me to go to his house. Finally, this woman who was overhearing our weird conversation and who could see I was getting very unnerved said it was time for him to be on his way. He then proceeds to give me his business card, which I may add was clearly homemade on regular printer paper and cut with scissors. He tells me to call him whenever I want to make hot sauce or have a drink. He went to the cashier to pay for his stuff, and I watched to make sure he left before going to pay for my things. When I walked out of the grocery store, he was standing outside waiting for me. Now I'm really freaked out and have a good 15-minute walk ahead of me. He asked me how I was getting home, and I didn't want to say I was walking, so I told him I was going to catch a cab. We'll share a cab. No, just share a cab with me. He was starting to get angry, so I flagged down a cab and I jumped in. He tries to get in the back, but I tell the cab driver that I don't know this man, and I don't want him sharing a cab with me, so he tells him to get lost. As we are driving away, I can hear him yell, "Fucking bitch!" I'm pretty shaken at this point. The cab driver drops me off at my house. When I get out, I see a car with the creepy man from the grocery store in it parked 2 houses down. He not only followed me to my house, but also had a car of his own. There was no reason for him to want to take a taxi with me. Now I was super scared and hurried inside. Thank God my 2 other roommates were both home. I told them everything that happened. One of my roommate's boyfriends was on his way over, so we decided to wait for him to get there before we did anything else. He just stayed there in his car watching our house for a good 15 minutes. When he saw my friend's boyfriend show up, he drove away, and I never saw him since. I then remembered that he gave me his business card, and I wanted to look him up online. First of all, the business card was for some photoshopping company, not chef. I typed the name and business into Google, and nothing came up. His name did not exist, and the company didn't exist either. I reported this incident to the police, but they said there was not much they could do since he didn't technically do anything. I'm not sure if this is related or not, but I have a gut feeling it was. Less than a week later, my roommates had class at 8:30 a.m., and I was still sleeping since I didn't have class until noon. I guess whoever last left forgot to lock the door. About an hour after they left, I woke up to the front door being closed. Thinking it was just one of my roommates, I thought the door would have been locked, so whoever it was would have needed a key. I just stayed in bed. I heard someone go into my roommate's room right next to mine, thinking it was her. And then a few moments later, I hear someone try my door. I lock it when I sleep at night and knock. But I was so tired I didn't want to get up and open it, so I just pretended to be asleep. Well, thank God for that, because none of my roommates were home, and it was actually an intruder. I heard whoever it was leave through the back door, which I thought was weird, so I got up and got dressed, and when I went out, no one was there. But turns out whoever it was stole my roommate's laptop and a picture we have in our living room of us 4 girls. Creepy. I reported all this to the police but never really heard anything back of it. I had lots of trouble sleeping and feeling safe in my own house after this incident. To this day, this experience creeps me out, and I don't want to imagine what would have happened if I opened my bedroom door to whoever was knocking. When I was younger, my mom and I used to ride bikes around my neighborhood together. One day, we decided to pick up some stuff at the local grocery store. When I was walking down the aisle, a man approached my mom and I. He was tall and bald. I can't remember much about his appearance. I was about 13 years old. He asked my mom if she had any other children, to which she replied yes, my brother of 4 at the time. However, keep in mind, all she said was she had a 4-year-old. Anyhow, the man gave her some business cards and told me to have a nice day. He seemed incredibly nice, in my opinion. About a week later, my mom and I were at the store again, and yes, we rode bike there. The man was there, but he was walking around with an empty shopping cart. He called out to my mom, but my mom kept nudging me to leave. "Elizabeth, wait!" he yelled. He approached us and asked how Sebastian, my brother, was. My mom said he was fine, but we were in a hurry, so she told him we had to leave. She had a panicked look on her face when we got outside, so I asked her what was wrong. She told me that she never told him my brother's name. That's when things started getting weird. Later that night, we went back to the store in a car this time. It was raining, but we never got to buy anything either, because we left. When we got there, the man was still there. He was still walking around with an empty shopping cart. My mom was creeped out, so she told me we'd come back in the morning. When we got to the car, it was freezing, so while we were waiting for the car to heat up, someone knocked on the car window. It was the man. I started screaming, and my mom put the car in reverse. When she reversed, the man ran in front of the car. She lowered her window a bit and told him to leave. "I just want to talk to you," he would shout, but my mom just drove around him. Finally, the next morning, we decided to go back to the store. We walked there. When we got there, the strange man was there. My mom went up to a security guard and told him everything. The security guard said he'd noticed the man a while back and has been waiting for someone to make a formal complaint. He said he knew exactly who the man was. It turns out he was just released from a mental hospital and his son was in jail for rape. He told us that he always comes to hit on women and stays there all day without ever buying anything. The officer then made a call and told us he'd watch out for the man to make sure he didn't follow us out. When we were crossing the street out of the grocery store parking lot, about 7 cop cars showed up and pulled out in front of the grocery store. The next time we went to the store, my mom asked the security guard what had happened, and he told us the man was taken into custody. Apparently they had a warrant for his arrest, and he had a stolen gun on his person. My name's Missy D. As some of you may know, I've worked my butt off to pay my way through college. I did have a small amount of cash put back, but it wasn't near enough to get me through a whole 4 years. So, the moment I arrived in the dorms, I hit the bricks on a search for employment. It wasn't long before I scored a job at a small Italian-style fast food dive just off of campus. The place was owned by 2 guys who we'll call Joe and Tony. They had come to the States as teenagers and worked various jobs until they had enough money saved to throw together and open the restaurant. Even though they had the knowledge of Italian food and the look of 2 men from the boot, I believe they were actually Albanian by birth. Despite being very close friends, the 2 men were quite different from each other, and because of this, they would often butt heads, but the disagreements never grew violent. Tony was the fun one of the 2. Working with him was always enjoyable, and I did my best to make sure I was scheduled to work the same shifts with him, but school sometimes prevented this, and I was stuck working with Joe. He was almost the exact opposite of Tony. A shift didn't go by without him cursing out one of the employees, myself included. Half of the time, you didn't even know what he was calling you because it was in a different language, but his body language said it all. I can't count the number of times I wanted to quit, but I knew I couldn't let my ego screw up my life, so I swallowed my anger and kept my head down. I didn't know it at the time, but things were already collapsing behind the scenes, and I wouldn't have that job for much longer anyways. About a week before Christmas break, I went in one evening and saw that both Joe and Tony were in the restaurant. This was unheard of in the 6 months that I'd been working there, and I quickly noticed a heavy feeling in the air I didn't like. I clocked in as usual and went straight to work. The strangest thing was that Tony nor Joe was talking to anyone other than short questions and phrases. Although it was pleasant not to be yelled at by Joe, Tony's cold demeanor only served to make me even more uncomfortable. All of us did our best to do our job, and things were going well until around 9 that night. I'm not sure how it started, but Joe and Tony were standing at one of the sandwich stations speaking in Albanian. From their body language, I could see that it was one of their usual heated arguments, but instead of choosing to walk away as one of them often did, the argument grew more loud and aggressive. Even though we were doing our best to ignore the disagreement, we still had orders to fill and we needed to be in the same area from time to time as them. They had been arguing back and forth for about 10 minutes when I had to go to the walk-in to get some olives. Upon my return from the cooler, my focus was diverted by a loud phrase yelled out by Tony. I could tell from his tone it was something bad, and it must have been considering Joe's reaction to it. The whole time that they had been talking, Joe had been slicing sandwich toppings and waving his knife around with each word like a conductor's baton. However, when Tony said whatever he had, Joe's face went blank. For a second, he stood and stared with a look of disgust on his face. But then, in the blink of an eye, he plunged the chef's knife into Tony's chest. Naturally, I froze and didn't know what to do. A look of shock grew across Tony's face once he realized what had happened. He continued to stare at Joe for a few seconds before he said, "What have you done, man? No." Then he slumped to the ground like a bag of potatoes. Joe looked down at Tony as he bled out and continued to stare for a short moment. I didn't know if he knew I was standing behind them, so I did my best not to move. Another of the girls must have been coming from the front and witnessed the same thing. We stood still, looking at one another, trying not to draw Joe's attention. Her eyes were as big as saucers, and I imagined mine looked the same. I had no idea if he would come after the rest of us, and the sick feeling in my gut got worse and worse. Although I'm not sure how long this all lasted, it couldn't have been more than a minute. Looking up from Tony's bleeding body, Joe slowly turned towards us, and I saw the hurt look on his face. It seemed as if though he was about to speak, but he stopped himself. Then he briskly walked between the two of us and out the back door. The second the door slammed shut, we both ran to Tony. His eyes were starting to roll back in his head, and the pool of blood was growing larger and larger by the second. It wasn't until then I remembered I had my phone in my pocket. I pulled it out and dialed 911. While I spoke to the dispatcher, the other employee gathered up a few towels and packed them around the knife to slow the bleeding. I quickly yelled to the girl running the register to lock the doors because there had been an accident and someone was badly hurt. After she did this, she ran to the back and began screeching when she saw Tony on the floor. The girl helping him on the floor told her to shut up, and she did, and she kept staring at him. The paramedics showed up in less than 5 minutes, and when they loaded Tony up, they said he was stable. We filled the police in on the history of Joe and Tony's relationship and the business. The two of us that had witnessed the stabbing gave a description of Joe, and they picked him up before we had even left the restaurant. They said they found him walking on the other side of the road not a mile away. When they asked who he was, he confessed to the attack and began crying. Once that was taken care of, the waiting began. Day after day, we prayed for Tony's recovery, and after 2 days, he started to improve, but by the end of the week, he passed. It was said that when Joe heard the news, his wailing could be heard throughout the entire jail. Considering his obvious regret, the DA decided to charge Joe with second-degree murder. Joe took a plea deal and will be in prison for at least the next 15 years. Since this happened in 2005, he'll likely be getting out in the next few years. I briefly considered showing up for his parole hearing and arguing against it, but despite his nasty disposition, I know he regrets killing his best friend and will have to live with that till the end of his days. So, I'll just leave it to fate to decide his future, just as it does for us all. I've been urged by those close to me to share my account of a recent life-changing event I experienced while working the drive-thru window at my fast food job. Until this happened, I had yet to fall victim to the irrational anger some carry around all day inside of them. I was unaware of how easily they can be triggered, and now that I have seen it firsthand, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully trust another human again. Although, at this time it is still very difficult for me to relive the event, I am encouraged that, to do so through this post, I may be able to begin to take charge of my life again. I guess I'll start at the beginning in order to make what came next make more sense. My name is Zoe Marie, but my friends call me Zoe. I'm currently 17 and will soon graduate high school a year early because I was allowed to skip ahead a grade when I was younger. In order to instill a strong work ethic into their young daughter, my parents encouraged me to get a job once I had turned 16. Not being one that wanted to disappoint my parents, I soon found a part-time job at a chain burger and fries restaurant near my home. I would often ride my bike the 2 miles after school and work a few hours during the weekdays and longer shifts on weekend evenings. So I had always had all of my things paid for up until that time. Seeing each check filled me with a mixture of awe and achievement. These feelings appeared to have done exactly what my parents had hoped and fired my will to work even harder. I'm not sure if this desire spawned from a place of greed. I'm sure the argument could be made. Nonetheless, I did look forward to each shift. My shift that night had started at the counter, but once the girl working the window ended her shift, I was moved to her station. At the time, I had no preference between counter and window. You came into contact with the rude and crude working both, and this night was no different. I had already had a big fat woman with her 3 snotty-nosed children in tow scream at me for making a small mistake in her order. Perhaps the only benefit I did have was that I rarely worked after midnight, so I didn't have to deal with many intoxicated customers that came later. The 1 or 2 times I did work later, I found it a trying experience. I'll keep my moral views to myself. I will only say that I see those who partake of alcohol as weak, and I'll leave it at that. My shift was ending in around an hour when I met my last customer. From the way the gentleman was speaking, I could tell he had been drinking that evening. The transaction was a string of confusion and chaos. He changed the order multiple times, and those in the car with him sounded as confused as him. The entire mess came to a head when I informed him that our shake machine was out of order. It was certainly broken. When I told him this, I was assaulted with a tirade of curses and derogatory names, and then he went silent. At first, I believed that there was something amiss with the headset, but I was wrong. The quiet was shattered by the squealing of tires. The cry of the tires was almost instantly joined by the roar of gunfire. I still believe to this day the only thing that saved my life was the sound of the tires. When I heard them, I leaned a bit forward in the window, almost putting my head out of the doors. I certainly expected an angry confrontation at that second, but coming face to face with the barrel of his gun as he extended his arm from his window, I instinctively ran for cover. The countless bangs from the gun and the screams of my fellow employees seemed to last a lifetime. No matter how I tried to drown them out by covering my head with my arms, they remained just as horrifying. I'm not sure when the firing finally stopped, but I didn't even consider raising my head until another of the employees shook me. I guess at the time he was checking to see if I had been struck by any of the bullets, but regardless of his intent, I hesitated a moment before I sat upright. To my dismay, 2 of the others working that night had been injured, and although neither of them died, I couldn't return to that restaurant or any of its kind for quite some time. Just now, over 6 months after this happened, can I finally see a business with a drive-thru window without having a panic attack? In the months since the attack, I have spent a large amount of time and energy in counseling in the hopes of regaining my courage and ability to be a useful member of society again. Whether it's due to feelings of guilt or fear, the road has been a hard one, and if it were not for the sense of purpose and the hard work ethic my parents have helped foster in me, I may not have even made it through school. Despite my heartfelt hopes and many prayers, the police have yet to find or arrest the thugs that attempted to take my life because of a freaking shake machine. The best I can do is continue to have faith in law enforcement and the universal force of right. I know someday, some way, they will be made to pay for what they have done. The only real solace I can find is the fact that no one has lost their lives because of something I did or said.